Chapter 3. The Rimhoth Bifatrarloika, Emergency Capital Relocation Order. The Glagak Glagaraker, Star Forces flagship, the Gothnosh, was a Ka-class patrol ship. As a combat-capable warship, it hadn't been altered or modded much. In that respect, it differed from the Imperial Fleet flagship, the San Kao, which, as the seat ship of Crown Prince cum Imperial Fleet Commander-in-Chief Du Sanyu, was specialized to serve as a flagship. It had EM cannons, but the space that normally housed mobile space-time mines was used instead for the residences and offices of command personnel. It took a plethora of staff officers to direct such a huge fleet. So long as it remained the custom for the Imperial Fleet flagship to serve as the flagship of a large and important operation, those modifications would remain necessary. Operation Twin Thorns was a special case in that it had been a two-front campaign, so the San Kao had been in the capital, but that was an exception to the rule. During Operations Phantom Flame and Hunter, it flew far afield from Lokfakar, emerging near the front lines. In cases such as Operation Quicksand, where the fleet was small-scale, but the Imperial flagship was nevertheless present, it came to the front lines alongside the rest of the fleet. That being said, Operation Quicksand involved no combat, so whether they could be called the front lines at all was questionable. By comparison, there were not many ships under the command of the Star Forces flagship Gothnosh. Though the Empress of the Humankind Empire of Ov was of course the highest commander, the Commander-in-Chief of Commanders-in-Chief, her duties in that capacity were usually conducted at the Imperial Palace. Switching from that throne to the one on the Gothnosh was typically only done during training or ceremonies. Ultimately, the Star Forces flagship just needed to have whatever functionality was required for the flagship of the Watchguard fleet. A patrol ship had space to spare, so the living quarters were widely used for passengers hitching a ride as well. Some patrol ships were built to serve as flagships to begin with. Those ships could install command centers without any modifications. The Gothnosh II was constructed as a flagship. The command center of the Watchguard fleet was around the same size as the command center of a standard fleet. It was enough to simply decorate the hatch used as the command center somewhat extravagantly, leaving the rest of the available space as it was. For that reason, the Gothnosh carried a fixed number of mobile space-time mines. And of course, its other weaponry was no different from other Ka-class patrol ships. Though it was extravagantly decorated, even emperors tended to value plainness while in the field of battle, so the Empress's seat ship actually had a rather dry vibe to it. Lamas gazed at the jade throne on the bridge before her eyes fell on the Imperial command baton. She wanted to give it to the King of Barca, but that didn't seem to be in the cards. The jade throne and the Imperial command baton were treasured heirlooms of the Humankind Empire of Ov, imperial treasures on par with the pillars standing in the Hall of Remembrance. They were handed down by successive generations of emperors. She would have liked to hand it down to her heir, Du Sanyu, and to his heirs by extension, if at all possible. However, what was important to both her and Du Sanyu was less that it be inherited down the generations so much as that it went to whoever was the emperor or empress at that time. If the empress fell in battle, the throne and the imperial command baton ought by all rights to crumble away as well. But the pillars were a different matter altogether. "All Watchguard fleets are ready and waiting for your majesty," reported Faramunch. "Very good." Lamas nodded and seated herself on the throne. Then she looked at the ship commander of the Gothnosh standing next to Faramunch, Hecto Commander Repeth. "The Star Forces flagship has made all the necessary preparations," said Repeth. "I see. Join with the Watchguard fleet post-haste." "As your majesty wishes." Unmoor the ship and engage maximum battle acceleration. The jade throne was by no means just an art piece carved out of precious stone. Any by birth could also use it as a Frocross booster. Lamas extended the access cables of her circlet, which was patterned after the 8-headed Gothnosh, and connected them to the armrest, allowing the information of the outside world as crunched by the Star Forces flagship Gothnosh to flow into her brain. Lamas could feel the capital all around her, a sensation she had enjoyed since she was a little girl. The first time she was allowed to fly an inter-system ship, she had dialed back the acceleration just so she could get absorbed in sensing the city. Since her enthronement, she no longer had that kind of time, but even afterward, she would set intersystem ships on inertial trajectories so as to have her fill of Lokvakar's embrace as often as not. The ship had already begun to move. She could feel the imperial palace behind her now. An academy was floating right by it, but it looked different from normal. It seemed small. Many trainees studied and lived in academies. Of course, Llama's was once one of those trainees. Now that she recalled, she also nursed her first crush at an academy. Several passenger ships had pulled alongside the academy to serve as the trainees' residential quarters. In normal times, she probably wouldn't have noticed they were even separate ships, but they had been serviced regularly and were fully stocked on supplies, so they could function as interstellar ships when the need arose. If one was of the opinion that trainees were of no use in the battlefield, then it made sense to send their living quarters away from the capital. The second news came that there was a chance that the horrors of war might reach it. But those trainees were also the Empire's future, and as such, they needed to be taken to the interim capital. Consequently, they departed only when the temporary capital's location was decided. The capital relocation planner had named Satrior as that location, and right after the Empress made the decision, the residential quarters became passenger ships carrying the trainees to the Barco portal. She knew that as of now, the trainees, her underclassmen, as it were, hadn't been informed what was going on. In fact, some would be taken through the portal while still asleep. Before long, she sensed the Garish Iraq Drya Bomber, capital manor of the Count of Both, in front and to the side. That commodal house held a lavish banquet once every 3 years. It was known for entertaining guests with striking and eccentric diversions and performances. It was as though the head of that household staked his life and soul on planning that sort of entertainment. One did not need a written invitation to participate. The only people barred from entering were the few who had cut too loose in the past. Apart from them, anybody could come and delight in the feast. When Llama's was a star pilot, she had participated in several banquets. On one occasion, she had been entreated by the Drya Bomber, Count of Both, to be the one to provide some entertainment. She was already the Queen of Cryeb and had plenty of time to kill, so she found herself agreeing to his request. Playing the role of the Goddess of Hell, she rode a vehicle drawn by 3 large dogs, charging any and all banquet-goers with chucklesome crimes and handing down delightful punishments. At first, she had been very shy and embarrassed about it, regretting ever agreeing to do it, but by the end she had been having a ball. So much so, in fact, that she felt a bit sad taking off the getup. Looking back on it now, she regarded it as a decently amusing experience. Llama's turned her attention to one of the spheres. If that isn't the Touch Cesar. The Touch Cesar, wine drops, was something of a giant balloon floating in space. Naturally, its walls weren't as poppable as a balloon, and it was sturdy enough to repel space refuse, but it didn't boast gravity control or the like. Inside it blew winds of various speeds, with countless pieces of playground-like equipment flying to and fro. Of course, the play equipment was furnished with safety measures, such as collision avoidance functionality. The facility was essentially an amusement park for children, but some believed it was also well suited for lovers to foster their feelings for each other. One of Llama's past Raic lovers was not just a holder of that opinion, he loved the place. He would invite her at the drop of a hat. That man was the gene donor of Llama's firstborn, the current king of Cryeb, Dubious. Her relationship with him lasted until a few years after Dubious's birth. When Dubious was very young, they'd even visited Windrops as a trio. But Dubious didn't take quite the shine to it that his gene donor, or as the majority of Landers would call him, father, did. He had inherited his mother's tastes. Llama's didn't particularly like the place herself. She was just humoring her lover. Dubious had had a better time visiting the Garish Irakardryor rank, capital manor of the Count of Ranch, which housed a combined zoo and botanical garden exhibiting genetically engineered life. It was a huge hit with children. To Llama's, the whole idea of it was rather distasteful, so she found this predilection of her son's disconcerting. In any case, she hadn't visited Windrops since she split up with Dubious's gene donor, and at some point, she forgot it existed. The Empress's job description was wide-ranging, but it didn't include managing amusement parks. That being said, the memories were rushing back one after another. Dubious's younger sister Lamlanek, the Countess of Gemfith, hated going to the Count of Rancha's capital manor. In fact, she hated going out in general. I wonder where her gene donor's gone to. She tried to remember, but couldn't. They had met on a patrol ship, and once she'd returned to the Imperial Palace, they would merely pay each other visits at their respective homes. She had no recollection of going out somewhere with that gene donor. Where is his estate again? She strained her frosh and tried searching for the manor she had visited all those times. Sadly, it was hidden among the countless artificial planetoids Lokfikar was made up of. The man loved to dance, and moreover, he loved to dance under the sway of gravity, like a lander. The two never got tired of treading on the floor with refined gaits, pacing halls suffused with ancient melodies. Lamans did grow tired of it, however, when Lamlanek came out of her artificial womb, and their affair ended there. Lamas heaved a slight sigh and gave up the search. The Gofnosh was about to leave Lokfikar. She realized it was about time for her to quit indulging in reminiscence. Eventually, they caught up to the Watchguard fleet. The Watchguard fleet consisted of 8 subfleets. They were named the Boksetic, Consetic, Circetic, Losexetic, Fisexetic, Litexetic, Dorsetic, and Muthsetic. Setic was Baranu for lightning, so another moniker for the Watchguard fleet was Seticlac, lightnings. Each of the subfleets was centered around a patrol ship, and the Dihazm stock ships were the kind that could accompany patrol ships. This made them more or less the same as recon subfleets. The ships that made up the Watchguard fleet were already spouting their propulsor flames and had begun to slowly accelerate. As soon as the Star Force's flagship Gofnosh joined them, those propulsor flames intensified, and they commenced maximum acceleration. All ships of the Watchguard fleet, all clear, reported Faramunch. Lamas nodded. Then head for the Cryb portal. But her command was a formality. The fleet had already formulated a navigation plan under the assumption they would be rushing through the Cryb portal. Though they didn't form part of the fleet, a swarm of orbital strongholds were flying the same route. Some were constructed as strongholds, and some were decommissioned warships. But none of them had planar space navigation functionality. Unlike the convoluted tangle that was Lokfikar's interior, there were very few man-made objects in the sector leading up to the Cryb portal. The one that stood out the most was the Cryb Royal Palace. It was where Lamas, Dubious, and Lamlanek were all born, though of course it was artificial wombs that gestated them. Needless to say, the Royal Palace was the place with the most indelibly ingrained memories for her. After the Watchguard fleet passed through the Cryb portal, the Royal Palace would become a fort tasked with defending the capital. The ships delivering the capital defense platoon to the Royal Palace mixed in with the orbital strongholds on the same route as the Watchguard fleet. The swarm of supply ships were standing by near the Cryb portal. They formed the corps dubbed the Sabre Ruaberer, deterrent Watchguard squadrons. The squadrons were not always formed and ready to go. They were temporary squadrons formed when the capital needed defending, made up of merchant ships that happened to be in the capital and didn't have any other suitable mission, and staffed by star pilots who happened to be in the capital awaiting new orders. As such, the numbers of ships and personnel depended on the situation. At present, there were 6 deterrent Watchguard squadrons. Their main cargo consisted of mobile space-time mines, and their role was to loose that cargo upon the enemy. That made their mission the same as battle line ships, but unlike warships proper, they could not defend themselves. In addition to the mines, the ships each had one conveyance ship loaded aboard, and it was those conveyance ships the crew were on. They were functioning as makeshift bridges. There were no mechanics branch personnel, so if the machinery and systems ever malfunctioned, that was it. The crew would simply escape the doomed supply ship using the conveyance ship. The Sabre deterrent squadrons had started passing through the Cryb portal slightly early. Supply ships were slow, so it only made sense for them to go ahead of the main forces. "We have received a call from the Cryb Royal Palace," reported Faramunch. "It's from Fanagak Nisith Lamamer, Her Eminence, Abdicant Empress Lamem." Lamem was Lamas's mother. As a former empress from the royal house of Cryb, She had taken on the responsibility of command over the Crybe royal palace. Lamaz was a mite jealous of her mother. She could meet her end while surrounded by memories. "Put her on the main screen," ordered Lamaz. "On the main screen, Your Majesty?" Faramunch raised an eyebrow. Lamaz understood where the military command director's discomfort was coming from. Transmitting the call through the main screen would let everyone on the bridge overhear. He was indirectly asking whether she was okay with it not being a private mother-daughter call. "Correct," she said regardless, getting to her feet. "May all who are free listen in." It wasn't necessarily the case that the people to whom these gathered star pilots wanted to send their last goodbyes were in the capital. In fact, more than a few of their loved ones were in another dimension, entirely planar space. If Lamaz wanted to, she could take her time conversing with Lamem. But the thought of making use of her privileges as Empress overly freely was shameful to her. If she indulged in a private conversation with her mother here and now, it would set a bad example, and she knew Lamem would understand. In fact, if Lamaz had taken this call to be a private one, Lamem would be disappointed in her. "Hark, Watchguard fleet." Just as she imagined, her mother addressed the entire fleet. "On behalf of the Council of the Abdicant Emperors, I, Abdicant Empress Lamem, do honor your service. Under normal circumstances, we would wish for your triumphant return, but no one in your fleet is daft enough to think such a remark anything other than empty words. Allow me, then, to make a wish as the Soberlock Arakar Glaherer Lartbear Crybe Hika, Imperial Capital Defense Platoon Crybe Royal Palace Fortress Commander-in-Chief. As you are aware, if the enemy fleets face no resistance, they will reach the Crybe portal within 72 hours. While my Larbe Hika, Royal Palace Fortress, is already possessed of combat power, we shall make for a yet stronger shield for the capital if we make further preparations. It is estimated that they will take 90 hours at the fastest. If you could hold them off for the difference, the 18 hours we need, we would be most grateful." Even as she was talking business, Lamem was staring into Lamaz's eyes. Of course, anyone facing the abdicant through the monitor would feel that way, but Lamaz was certain that whatever screen her mother was looking at featured her face. Lamem smiled, and Lamaz smiled back. That sufficed for their conversation. They had known each other for a century after all. "Now then, I bid you farewell. I wish to reunite with as many of you as possible." The brief call ended there. Both the Watchguard fleet and the Crybe Royal Palace Fortress had more than enough on their plates. "We will soon be passing through the Crybe portal," said Faramunch. The deterrent squadrons all passed through to planar space. The Gofnosh went ahead of the main forces of the Watchguard fleet through the portal. "Planar space map coming up," said an exploration staff officer. The second it was pulled up, groans overtook the Rugahor, Imperial Seat Ship Bridge. The way to the Sode Sembri of Portal, was half filled up by enemy fleets. There had to be more than 200 subfleets in planar space alone. And that wasn't counting the core lurking in the portal. Of course, they had the information about the enemy's force of arms in advance. Even so, when they advanced into the same stretch of planar space, the pressure was overwhelming. In 3 space, portals looked like spheres. In planar space, they looked like distorted spiral lines. There was no way to know beforehand where on the portal line one would enter through. It was a matter of pure probability. The supply ships of the deterrent squadrons at the fore had not yet assembled. Though each squadron's flagship had been decided, a Glagum Iadbira Reherer, Deterrent Squadron Command Center, to manage the 6 squadrons didn't exist. They were each under the direct supervision of Glagum Ruberer, Watchguard Fleet Command. The staff immediately set about gathering together the scattered supply ships. They were all steered by experienced star pilots, but they were still a cobbled-together corps, so their cohesion was lacking. Moreover, they were almost all retired star pilots, and it had been a while since they'd last run a ship. Without the direction of a flagship, their reassembly was not terribly efficient. They must feel all the more disheartened for it to have happened before enemy eyes, thought Lamaz. Around when the deterrent squadrons were beginning to reassemble, the Watchguard fleet emerged subfleet by subfleet. Just like the deterrent squadrons, they were disconnected when they came through, but the way they reassembled was something to see. Each managed to fully reassemble before the next subfleet came through. 18 hours, she mused inwardly. She wanted to give her mother this final present, but it would be extremely difficult. That said, she had no other choice. She gazed at the planar space map. The gap in power was vast. If they strayed too far from the cryo portal, they would be circumvented by the bulk of the enemy. Faramunch, are you able to pinpoint the optimal place to intercept them? With all due respect, that is precisely what I understand to be my primary mission. No sooner had the military command director said that dotted lines appeared on the planar space map. It's here. How long would it take to bring the fleet there? An estimated 34 hours, 30 minutes. Where would the enemy vanguard be at that time? Assuming they don't make any detours, that would be here. A blip appeared on the planar space map. Llamas nodded gently to reassure the staff officers. Present our plan of advance. I shall have the navigation officer explain. With that, the navigation staff officer stepped before the throne with a nervous expression. She brought up a number of diagrams as she suggested the routes and formations the fleet ought to take, Llama is asking questions all the while. Very well. At those words, the navigation officer was visibly relieved. Yet the Empress had another question for her. Are we ready to march? The navigation officer was flustered. The Empress's question was related to the woman's field, but she'd been so focused on explaining the plan that she hadn't taken full stock of the present moment. Currently, replied Faramunch in her stead, the rearmost lightning, the Dorsetic, is just passing through the portal. I am told it shall take 12 or so more minutes. Then we shall march as soon as our preparations are complete, said Llamas. As your majesty decrees, so it shall be done. Now tell us the plan of operations. Certainly. Eventually, the whole of the Watchguard fleet had begun to advance. Earth had said they would be taking the air out, but that didn't truly mean all of the air. The Hall of Remembrance's atmospheric pressure was now an eighth of what it used to be, harsh conditions without a pressure suit. To top it all off, the gravity had been reduced to around a tenth of the usual levels, though relatively speaking, the standard off-gravity level was low to begin with. It was set at around half of the surface gravity of the planet that gave rise to humankind. As Jin happened to have been raised at the bottom of a gravity well, he actually found it harder to walk within this extremely reduced gravity. The pressure and gravity were reduced in order to facilitate the toil of packaging the pillars of praises, which was done mostly by hand. On occasion, the off were almost weirdly well prepared, but given what a corner case transferring the Hall of Remembrance was, it was no surprise there was no specific mechanism in the Imperial Palace for it. The workers in quasi-pressure suits enclosed the pillars of praises in long and narrow slabs, 6 to each pillar. Thus, they were being made into hexagonal prisms. At first, Jin figured them for ordinary slabs, but upon closer inspection, he realized they had rotating handles, which the workers cranked when they were done enclosing a pillar. According to Earth, the slabs were filled on the inside with a compressed foaming agent, and by cranking the handles, that foaming agent was released so as to fill up the space between the enclosing prism and the pillar. Apparently, the agent tenderly embraced the pillar while in foam form before hardening and becoming a packing material with some elasticity to it. The exterior surface of the Imperial treasures are sensitive, Earth continued. I'm worried that even these measures aren't enough to properly preserve them. As such, I ask that you exercise the utmost caution transporting them. I mean, there's only so much I can do, thought Jint. His responsibility went as far as getting them loaded aboard. There was little he could do after that. He could keep a close eye on the gravity in the mine deck and take a special care not to damage the cargo. That was about it. Not that there was any real need to check the gravity outside of combat. If the gravity took a hit, that meant they'd found themselves in battle, which would mean Jint, as the clerk, would be preoccupied with the important task of safeguarding the crew's lives. If the Gothnosh Drade were forced to enter the fray, then they'd already more or less failed their mission. With that in mind, then as a quartermaster star pilot, Jint's hands were even more tied. Understood, Jint replied, despite all that. That was the grown-up response. Besides, if something did happen, it was future Jint that would be held accountable. "How do you plan to go about it, specifically?" asked Irf. To tell the truth, Jint had been warming up to a particular idea for some time, but he still hadn't told anyone just yet. It was an idea he didn't want to put into practice if at all possible. But under Irf's clinging gaze, he screwed up his resolve. "What would you say to filling the mine deck holding the Imperial treasures with a foaming agent?" "A splendid idea," said Irf, his face lighting up. "Please, go right ahead. I don't know how feasible it would be, but I will expend every effort." He thought he might not have to put it into effect because he figured it would be hard to procure foaming agent. Even if it wasn't, there were a massive amount of things Jint had to procure. A clerk on a warship about to sortie had plenty of work to do even without pillars of praises to worry about. And it took less than a day from when the Watchguard fleet made a sally for Jint to learn that the clerk of a ship returning to duty was incomparably busier than his colleagues on warships about to sortie. With hindsight, he realized how easy his first job, back when he'd been the clerk of an assault ship, had been. He'd been nervous due to inexperience, but every time he accomplished something, he would realize what an easy job it was. It felt anticlimactic. Roger-class assault ships were mass-produced, so there was no wiggle room when it came to what or how much to load. In point of fact, the supplies had been stocked in the ship as part of the final stage of its construction process, before Jint had proceeded to his new appointment. All he'd done was check to see whether there was too much or too little. Then he just needed to resupply whatever was in short supply whenever returning to a port. The raid ship was a new class of ship, so it wasn't quite as easy, but it was the job of a highly experienced Yugtexober, squadron clerk, to fret over things. All Jint had to do was keep on top of whatever his ship commander ordered him to do. This time was different. Needless to say, the Goftnosh Draider was not a cutting-edge ship. While it was an H-class patrol ship, which were once mass-produced as capital ships, the last time an H-class ship made sortie was around a century ago. That made it even harder to deal with than a cutting-edge ship. Rather carelessly of Jint, he hadn't known that the Star Forces had a small corps called the Bioarefessor, Extolment Fleet, which preserved the Goftnosh Draider and 10-odd other memorial ships in working order. That meant all he had to resupply was the antimatter fuel and the propellant, and it would work for the time being. However, that didn't mean it could withstand long voyages. The ship's outer hull was no different from that of newer ships, but the internal equipment had aged. Even just inspecting it was a tall order. The mechanics branch personnel, led by Samson, were having a devil of a time. The budget branch personnel weren't struggling quite as hard as Samson's group, but they couldn't exactly afford to be twiddling their thumbs waiting for departure, either. They had to check whether the life support system, which was under their jurisdiction, was capable of withstanding long-term continuous operation. Normally, they could just run an inspection, but unfortunately the equipment on old patrol ships was riddled with problems. And, try as they might to replace some components, there were more than a few cases where they were no longer in production. Naturally, they hadn't the time to manufacture them. They ultimately had no choice but to replace the entire apparatuses. Furthermore, no matter whether the equipment was under the control of the budget branch, the mechanics branch, the flight branch, or some other, it was Jint's job as the clerk to procure it. Yet another cause for distress for Jint was the fact that Goftnosh Draider was not the only ship rushing to leave the capital. Until now, he had but to request the necessary supplies and equipment through the CompuCrystal network, and it'd arrive at the designated place by the scheduled date. He had heard of incidents where the delivery of the goods came delayed due to some slip-up, but those were just nasty rumors to him. It had never happened to Jint or the ships he'd been the clerk of. But it was a different story now that the capital was evacuating. He had ordered various goods via the Capital CompuCrystal network, but he hadn't been given an estimated time of arrival. If it was out of stock, there was nothing for it. Fortunately, it wasn't Jint's job to scrutinize the replacement goods. There were also times when he received a message back that the location of what he was looking for was known, but it couldn't be delivered. This meant they had no choice but to go retrieve it. Jint didn't have enough subordinates for the job. Luckily, other departments were there to lend a hand. Without the necessary machine parts, they wouldn't be able to fulfill their responsibilities either. Due to their numbers and closely related work duties, it was chiefly mechanics branch personnel that went to collect the machine parts. Jint got his hands on the foaming agent 2 days after he told Urf his plan. Around that time, Jint was on duty on Gofnosh Drader's Bridge. "Sorry," said Samson, "but could you wake up?" Reluctantly, Jint opened his right eye. If it was only a dream, he planned to close it and go back to sleep. Alas, Samson was standing there, in the flesh. Jint stretched in his clerk's seat. He checked the time on his wrist gear. 55 hours and 37 minutes had elapsed since the watchguard fleet was dispatched. In the meantime, Jint had slept for nary 3 hours. No, it may have been about 2 hours. The numbers were blending together in his mind. Jint switched the wrist gear to another setting. 16 hours, 22 minutes, 27 seconds, the estimated shortest time for enemy ships to enter the Count Dom of Avriel. The watchguard fleet was currently fighting the good fight to extend that time frame, and by what little time they could. "What is it?" "I want to dispatch 3 people," said Samson. "To the warehouse of Sakura Limited." Where is that?" asked Jint blearily. "I don't know. It's definitely in Lokvakar, though," said Samson through a yawn. "It's got a traffic bureau registration number." Lokvakar was essentially a collection of innumerable artificial planetoids whose positions relative to each other were in constant flux. It didn't make sense to have addresses, so tracking numbers managed by the Capital Traffic Bureau were used instead. If one established an information link with the bureau, it would guide their way. The problem was that most of the mechanics branch people, including Samson, were landworlders and could not steer small crafts. They were forced to ask flight branch star pilots for assistance. Jint scanned the bridge, but there were no flight branch star pilots around. In fact, there was no one besides him and Samson. He placed a call through his wrist gear. "Liwing Nombok, are you busy at the moment?" "Yes, sir," came his exhausted voice. "I'm asking you again." That was all Jint had to say. "Roger that," replied Nombok promptly. As there was no visual, Jint couldn't tell from Nombaka's appearance, but judging by his voice, he didn't sound fatigued anymore. Jint was impressed. "Where are you now?" "The steering room of the Gofnosh Drader's small craft, sir. The small craft is currently parked in the takeoff deck." Jint turned to Samson. "You're grabbing some cargo, right?" "Yep." "Is it the kind that can go in a small craft?" He didn't know what the cargo was specifically, nor did he really want to know. He'd probably authorized ordering the stuff before he took his nap. It was the ship commander's job to approve ordering materials, but it appeared Lafier was busy with her duties as an Imperial, so the going policy was to entrust as much as possible to her subordinates. And Jint had been delegated to deal with the placement of orders. There was no need to run everything by her. Honestly, though, they don't need to run it by me either. It wasn't as though Jint was carefully examining the contents of the orders. If Samson said they needed it, then he figured they needed it. "It can't be loaded inside, so I plan to have them tow it. It's the people I'm sending and the company that'll make the arrangements, so all the skipper needs to do is pilot." Samson knew not to talk about the cargo in detail, saying only what Jint needed to hear. "Never change, Mr. Samson." And Jint meant that in both ways it could be interpreted. Then he addressed Nombok again. "Could you ready the ship for takeoff and wait there? I'd like you to send 3 of our people to this Sakura Limited place." "Roger that. Please give me their names and military registration numbers." Jint looked at Samson, who worked his wrist gear, and nodded in reply. "Sent," said Samson. "They were sent. Check to see if you got them," Jint told Nombok. "I have, sir," said Nombok. "Please and thank you," said Jint. "Understood." The flight branch star pilots had their own work to do, though what that was, Jint wasn't sure. In any case, Nombok was not a subordinate of his. He had no authority to order him around. This was simply a request as a comrade on the same ship. Their lives were in each other's hands. "It's a go," said Samson through his wrist gear. He could only be speaking to the 3 he was dispatching. "Head to the takeoff deck. There should be a small craft there. I'm guessing there's an off lad sleeping in the steering room or something." "What was that? You want to shake him awake? Don't forget he's your superior. You need to wake him up respectfully, all right?" With that, Samson dropped the call and faced Jint. "Don't get me wrong, I'm happy that Nombok lad's helping us out, but doesn't he have his own work to do?" "He isn't in charge of the navigation equipment," said Jint. "That was the job of the extolment fleet." I know that. It's the same for the main engine system. But is he good for gunner stuff? In truth, not all of the Flickaba's crew had been assigned to the Gothnosh Raider. That had been the idea at first, and leaving the Flickab to cruise virtually unmanned was seriously considered. As a side note, they'd understood it would be impossible to leave it to a new crew. The Star Forces in the capital were terribly short on manpower at the moment. They had to make do with a limited workforce. Jint didn't know what kind of discussion had taken place or where, but in the end, it was decided that the Flickab would participate in Trample Blitz Squadron 1 sortie. That said, it was set to turn its back on the battlefield, but it would have to fight when the situation called for it. Given the possibility of engaging in combat, it was out of the question to leave it unmanned. Consequently, the Flickab was preparing to leave port under the Vice Commander and Sarah Kvera, acting Ship Commander, Deca Commander Ekriwa. Jint heard that his replacement was dispatched from Squadron Command. Jint had never met the replacement, but apparently, they were a young star pilot fresh out of Quartermaster Academy. Moreover, it seemed they were this close to enlisting a Benaic Lodir Sazoir, trainee Quartermaster star pilot, for the job, too. Yet Jint wasn't worried about the Flickab, or at least, not when it came to clerk duties. Cobb-class raid ships had already proven themselves, and sortie preparation procedures had been standardized. Most saliently, they had a squadron clerk. Even an inexperienced quartermaster star pilot was fit for the job with that kind of help. In fact, Jint was jealous of his substitute. All of which was to say, there were only a handful of flight branch star pilots assigned to the Gothnosh Raider. Put bluntly, as far as Jint knew, it was only Nombach and Ship Commander Lafier. The discussion resulted in the rest of the flight branch star pilots remaining aboard the Flickab, where they were busy readying the ship for the sortie. In less than an hour, Grentia, Samson's ostensible superior, had returned to the Flickab, leaving him to deal with what was supposed to be her job. Though it was a giant ship, it didn't take that many flight branch star pilots just to get it moving. Most of them boarded warships to operate the fire control systems. And the Gothnosh Raider had next to no arms to speak of. All it had been left with were 2 EM cannons and a meager amount of mobile cannons. Jint didn't know whether those cannons were usable. If it was on someone to look into that, it would be the one flight branch star pilot apart from the ship commander, Nombach. Normally I would ask him, but I'd rather he didn't come at us with any ideas about actually double-checking the weapons, said Jint. We can't have that. If we end up in combat, we'll be done for. I'm joking, said Jint, though he'd been half serious. He didn't have much confidence in the Gothnosh Raider's self-defense capabilities. While it used to be the glorious Star Forces flagship, he figured it was basically akin to a supply ship at the moment. Besides, if you want to make it combat ready, that's for the ship commander to manage. Indeed, it wasn't up to the clerk to decide whether the Gothnosh Raider should be made combat ready or not. Well, you've got a point there. Guess you're not the only one who's worked to exhaustion. I haven't been gone from the military that long, and look at me, forgetting what every soldier knows from day one. What every soldier knows. Yeah, just focus on your own job. That way it's easier on the workers, and in the end, it's a good thing for the organization as a whole. If, of course, that organization is the Star Forces. When would that not be the case? Oh, I dunno. Maybe a grandee's house that just got off the ground. Ah, right. Jint smiled wryly. Must have developed a bad habit for that sort of thing. Not really. My dream is to manage a farm. My experience as a servant vassal will serve me more than my experience as a soldier. I'm relieved to hear that. I'm grateful to mine lord. I might not be your lord for much longer, Mr. Samson. Oh, how those words sadden me. Have you some grievances with my performance, mine lord? You know what I'm saying. There's a good chance contact with the Countdom of Hyde will be closed off again. If it gets closed off again, then we'll just have to pry it back open, said Samson. Not that it's for us to think about, either. We don't even know if we'll survive for that long. Oh, prithee, mine lord, I implore you not to be so weak-kneed as to say something of the like despite being so much younger than me. You can say that, but Jint was about to protest, but he kept his mouth shut. Samson had passed out in his chair.